All right. Well, he kicked us off last night with a great talk, and he's going to introduce a new topic now with what is the Quran? It's Dr. Daniel Brubaker.
So in 2010, the book Chrislam was published. How many people here have seen that or read that book, been familiar with it? Okay, you should know what it is and at least be familiar with it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It dealt with a serious problem: the translation of Bibles by major Christian mission organizations in such a way as to surgically omit biblical theology that is offensive to the theology of the Quran. Namely, references to any familial relationship in the Godhead. Jesus' references to God as my Father became my Lord in accordance with the Quran. This is in the Bible. Translations. References to Jesus as the Son in relation to God were likewise removed. But why? The reason was this: to increase the fruit of their ministries in Muslim contexts, that is, the numbers of people who responded to the gospel and became Christians. I'm putting these in air quotes. These organizations and their operatives decided that it was okay to change the Bible in such a way as to make it less offensive to Muslims. Meanwhile, knowing that changing the Bible would be unacceptable to their donors, the ministry organizations kept the details of their translation projects secret from these donors and only reported the tremendous successes that they were seeing among Muslims, among whom God was doing a great work, and so forth. What these donors never heard until the publication of Chrislam, many of them, blew the lid open, was that these converts from Islam who already loved and revered the Quran's version of Jesus were being told that the Bible does not teach that Jesus called God his Father, or that he called himself the Son, and so forth, but just that Jesus, in complete harmony with the Quran, was only calling God my Lord, or Allah. Furthermore, these, quote, converts were only being told to continue, were often being told to continue calling themselves Muslim, to continue reading the Quran, to continue going to mosque and saying the 5 daily prayers, and so on. In other words, continuing to act as though nothing whatsoever had changed in their lives. And indeed, nothing really had changed. The theology of the Bible had been so severely compromised that to that of the Quran that really there was little cause to believe that many of these converts had ever understood or responded to the gospel in the first place. Furthermore, studies confirmed that, lacking a visible witness, often even the spouse or children or parents of the convert or community or so forth never even knew that their loved one had even become a Christian. And so any such fruit, such as it was, invariably died off with that individual, making no further impact for the gospel whatsoever. And most tragic of all, many of or all of those converts likely went to a Christless eternity, dead in their transgression, since they never understood the true gospel of Jesus. So what was even the point of making those translations? And why do I bring up the matter of Bible translation in a talk that is titled, What is the Quran? The answer, of course, is that the people responsible for this travesty had failed to correctly understand what the Quran is. And you've just heard a little bit about all the various problems, and this is why I think it's a very good setup for this conversation. Internally, to the Quran and its history and so forth. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the critical work that is being done on the history of the Quran now and in the later talk this afternoon as well. If those organizations had known what we're going to ultimately discuss now, they would have never allowed the Word of God to be compromised. So let's take a few minutes to talk about the Quran, what it is. First of all, as many people here know, the Quran is today, what is considered the Quran is a book. This is a Arabic text with a side-by-side English. To Muslims, anything that is translation is not considered to be the Quran. It is the Arabic Quran, and until recently, it was very widely understood that Arabic Quran was always uniform across every current manifestation and physical representation of it. And so thanks to the work of Hatun Tash and Jay Smith and others, it's becoming more commonly accepted that even the current print editions, there are some variations, some of them significant, I guess all of them significant if you understand things the way that many Muslims today understand it. But also, as we'll talk about a little bit later this afternoon, in the manuscripts and so forth, there are many, there's much more complexity to the situation than had been hitherto understood. And of course, as is often the case in the academic and scholarly world, many of these things are understood and known before they kind of disseminate out into popular culture. But the awareness of this fact, of the complexity and the history, was what prompted Yasser Qadhi to make his admission, which was, in my view, a very honest and fair admission a couple of years ago, that drew so much fire and criticism of him by others when he said the statement about the quote-unquote holes in the narrative. It is sometimes dangerous to let people in the wider public know what is going on at higher academic levels of study. So the Quran is an Arabic book. It is perceived by Muslims to be a complete. It's 114 chapters. It's arranged not in any particular chronological way. That we now have an understanding based upon the many traditions, an idea of when these different sections were revealed, and this is interpreted through an entire huge body of secondary literatures that some of it was shared with you just now, that tell when this was revealed, how it was revealed, how it was all these different things. But it's arranged in mainly in terms of the length of the chapters themselves. And so you start with one very short one, and then a bunch, and then you go to the longest ones, and then it kind of diminishes in length until you have a bunch of very short chapters at the end. It's divided into verses. Everything, the text is mainly written, mostly written in a poetic rhyming pattern, rhythmic rhyming pattern in Arabic. It is theological in nature. There are internal contradictions and difficulties which gave rise to, as has already been talked about in this conference, the need to deal with those. And one way, the most common way that they were dealt with, is with a doctrine called naskh, which is abrogation, the idea that some verses would cancel out others if there was a conflict. And so there are all these kind of issues going on internally in the Quran that were dealt with in various ways, and it gets fairly complicated. But so the Quran is preserved. We have it in a physical form most of the time. When we have Qurans today, as you see out on the table, and we see around us, they're Qurans in a book form. But parallel to that, and especially when we're looking at the history and thinking about how it happened, it was parallel transmission was oral. It's claimed that it was transmitted at the same time orally, and certainly at the earliest stages, it was presented as having been delivered orally by Muhammad. So the way that this came about is that he would receive a revelation through Gabriel. And it's interesting, Muhammad never got revelations directly from God. It's very interesting. He's a seal of the prophets, and here we have Moses is speaking directly to God and so forth. And and the other prophets. But Muhammad only came through the agency of the angel Gabriel, much like Joseph Smith. Not that it's not anyway. Yeah. But which I think is an important point, because these are details that it's worth observing and understanding. In any event, what would happen is the angel Gabriel would deliver a revelation to him. He would go recite it in the mosque in prayer. People would hear it. They would imitate him. They would memorize what he was reciting, and then that would how it came to be, according to traditions, which we don't have until 150 years later. It got written down later. But according to those traditions, this is how it happened. People would memorize it. They would be preserved in their hearts. And sometime around the time of his death, they started to, during his lifetime, they started writing it down on little bits and pieces, things available like palm stalks and bones and different things. And then at some point, they started to gather it together. And all this is obviously up in the air, because there are revisionist theories about whether this even happened in the first place. So this is what was being reported to us. The point is that there was a period of time, even according to Islamic tradition, that it was preserved only as an oral text, and then it got brought together into a form and organized in some way, and then preserved in writing, first in bits and pieces, and then gathered together and formed into a what we call a mushaf. Mushaf is the word for code, is translated codex. It is a book that is bound on one end as in contradistinction to a scroll. And so at some point it got written down that way. Now, whether that was at the very beginning, we have manuscripts that are radiocarbon dated, and I'll talk about that a little bit more this afternoon, that seem to be radiocarbon dated early, during the lifetime of Muhammad, near the lifetime. Sometimes some of the radiocarbon dating indicates a possibility of even before he was born. It's kind of the Wild West out there right now in that. But the point is that you have an oral text and you have a written text, and the Quran came to exist in that way, came into our hands that way. Now, a lot today, we are more of a written culture. So the assertion is often made that because the context in which the Quran came, that they were an oral culture. We think about memorizing things and we make mistakes, and I try to memorize a 10-minute talk or 20-minute talk or something like that. You're going to make little I was talking as we're driving here today with Edward Delcor. He used the term verbal typos. We make verbal typos, right? But the assertion is made that when you live in an oral culture where everything is transmitted orally, you're much more able to be faithful and perfect in your transmission and so forth. And I think this is probably an example. We know the word hagiography, and you know what that word means. It's the sort of the glorification of some person, usually some person in the past, so they become more and more perfect as time goes by. As you reflect, it's like the golden age. Because we admire them, right? We admire the person, and so we want to think only the best things and forget the worst things and so forth. And there's nothing necessarily wrong about it. That's what we do with people that we admire. This happens, I believe, with things other than people as well. And so I think the backward memory of what how the Quran was transmitted and preserved and all that is subject to a bit of hagiography as well. It's made very clean and easy, but it really, as you look closer at the physical evidence, which, by the way, is the only way that we know anything about what happened. We don't have any way of we don't have any way yet. We don't have a time machine. Anybody here have a time machine? Anything? So we can't travel back and hear what was being orally transmitted, right? We don't know. It's easy to say, oh yeah, this was perfectly transmitted back then. We don't know. We don't. All we can do is we can go from the physical stuff. So, which is why I try to focus on the manuscripts, the inscriptions, the coins, and so forth. Those are our points of contact with a identifiable or nearly identifiable time in the past. Okay. So that being said, maybe I'll come back to this, but obviously the role of the Quran in the lives of Muslims today is very central. It is it's interesting because it has this power, it's lifted up. It is the revelation from Muhammad. It's the final revelation. It's the one that actually cancels out everything else, and which is really concerning, actually, if you think about the tenuous nature of what we just heard from Hatun Tash and from some of these things in the manuscripts. It's concerning if that is the thing, and even what was said last night about the fact that it is only through a single witness. Like you have to trust me. Okay, this is going to cancel everything else. If it disagrees with everything else, it's going to cancel that out. All those prophets before, this is the thing that you now have to rely on. That's, and given all the messiness that's going on with that's concerning. And given the fact that you have some verses that are only attested by singly attested, as Hatun just mentioned, then you have the question: is it that person who was transmitting it were they inspired? And that's not even there are layers upon layers of this. So we have the story of Uthman's standardization, which was mentioned as well. Now I tend to refer to Uthman's standardization as his campaign of suppression. Everybody says standardization. Okay, he was standardizing the text, but he was burning the alternates. So what he was really doing was he was suppressing alternate text. When he didn't want anybody to see, they didn't want anybody to see or have any disagreement about what those other ones were later on, and so they were destroyed. And so I think it's useful to use language in a precise way, and so I call it a campaign of suppression. Whether it happened or not, it could be referencing something else, but okay. So the perception of the Quran among Muslims is going to have to adjust, I think, in coming years. We have a moment of, by a moment of opportunity, I mean the opportunity that we have as believers who are trying to sort of break that barrier, that stone wall that you have when you're speaking with people, is kind of open now, because there's a little bit of a breach in the wall. We don't want to be mean or nasty or terrible to people. We want to discover what's truth. We want to stand side by side with other people and pursue what's true together and call other people to do it. And so I think there's an opportunity now to do that. But I do believe that as we look at the Quran itself, there's going to be an adjustment period while Muslims are going to be sort of retooling their understanding of what their text is or what they assert it to be. And it's going to sort of build up this new defensive structure around it. And that's fine, and that's natural. That's what people do, and so forth. All right. So when did the Quran come to be? I just want to hit through a couple of points here. So Muhammad was born, according to tradition, in 570 AD. He began receiving revelations around 610 AD when he was about 40 years old. And then he died in 632. So that was a period of about 22 years there that he was reported to have been receiving these revelations. And he didn't, I assume some of you know this, but he didn't even know that it was the angel Gabriel who was speaking to him at the first, when this thing first happened outside of Mecca, supposedly in a cave outside of Mecca. It was his wife, Khadija, who had to go through this sort of process of testing to figure out what was going on here. And then she was the one who told him that this was Gabriel, and surely you are a prophet of Allah. That's pretty good news. Your wife tells you that you're a prophet of Allah. So according to the reports, that's how it happened. Where did it come to be? Well, okay, this is the big question right now. Did it happen in Mecca as is reported, or did it happen somewhere else? And you've seen videos from Jay Smith and others dealing with this. We have Dan Gibson pursuing the theory of an alternate location, possibly in Petra, and there are many interesting things about that. These are what are called revisionist, I suppose, but there's nothing new in the idea of sort of poking at things to see if there's an alternate way that we can understand the evidence. Because remember, we're looking at physical evidence. We're thinking about what we can sink our teeth into, what we can lay our hands on, and so forth. And you're shifting it around and go, okay, this doesn't really make sense. There are problems with the standard narrative, right? The problem's archaeological in Mecca. There doesn't seem to be evidence of stuff having been there at that time period. There are problems internally in the Quran in terms of the descriptions of things that of what would have been Mecca. It doesn't seem to comport with the climate and the environment and so forth of Mecca. There are linguistic issues that scholars kind of fall on different sides of the linguistic things, but internally there are linguistic things that get looked at in the Quran. Does it match with with having had an origin in that part of Arabia? There are Gunter Lulling and more recently Christoph Luxemburg have looked at the linguistic comparing it with Syriac. There are words in the Quran that have come to be interpreted and understood in certain ways by the exegetes. Those people who are interpreting it, they've understood words in certain ways, and so they sort of had to make up things to explain what this word means or so forth. And the exegetes are disagree with each other on some things, or they have different interpretations. But the interesting thing is that when you look at this through the lens of Syriac, now Syriac and Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages. They're very, very close to each other, but they look different. Hebrew looks different from Arabic, and Syriac looks different from Arabic. If you read them, you can tell that they're the triliteral root and they're similar languages and so forth. But when the theory of Luxemburg and Lulling was that the Quran, large portions of the Quran were were actually drawn from Christian material and brought into Arabic, and then there was a lapse of time in the understanding, or there was a misunderstanding of what these words actually meant, and then a reinterpretation of what the words meant, and so it stopped looking entirely, sort of looks like Christian material, but it stopped looking entirely like Christian material, and then you have other theology developing around it and so forth. But I think that's a very, Luxemburg's book generated a lot of discussion, and I think rightly so. That's a very important aspect. And then, of course, the other thing that Dan Gibson looked at, and we're talking about the Quran itself, like where did it happen? Did it happen in up north? Right. So I want to bring that back around. Let's see if there's any other aspect of there. Number of critical theories about the origins. Right. So I want to bring it back around now to the key point. And when we look at the Quran, one thing that is really important to emphasize is what I mentioned at the beginning, is that retranslation and the removal of the familial language from the Bible translations. Why did they do that? They did it because they thought that the Quran, they did it under the pretense of believing that the Quran was a cultural manifestation, that there was just a cultural difference. Many times missiologists will look and say, okay, how do we get the gospel to be understood by people who, I read Peace Child. How many people here have read Peace Child, Don Richardson's book, right? So what he did is he found a key to explain the gospel in a context where people, explain the gospel, and all of a sudden Judas was the hero, and these people, because they lifted the treachery as one of the highest ideals, and they thought, wow, how is he able to fool Jesus all this time and then betray him in the end? And that's amazing. Judas is amazing. And once he had done the work of learning the language and trying to understand and explain this to the people, and then imagine the despair when they completely don't get the story. So he had to find a key into that culture, and he did. It's like, you have to read it. You get to the end of the book, and it's like, oh my goodness, you realize that God did place a key, and he just had to understand. So missiologists are trying to find ways to communicate into cultures and communicate the gospel in a way that people understand. So the people who, I'm giving them a very generous benefit of the doubt because there's really no excuse for what they did with the Bible translations here. But they were purporting to understand the Quran as a cultural, the whole edifice around the Quran as a cultural manifestation. And they were failing to see it as a theological attack on the person and work of Jesus Christ. Now, when we look at the Quran, and I think it's good also to hold it alongside the Book of Mormon and what happened with Joseph Smith, the stories are very similar in how they were revealed and so forth. I think there's something spiritual that happened there. You understand as that all the cults, and by the way, Islam is a Christian cult. It's been more than 1,000 years, so we think of it as its own world religion now, but it is a cult of Christianity. And what it did, because all the Christian cults, anybody here read Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults? All the cults take Jesus and they take him off the throne. They do something wrong with it. They take away the heart of the gospel. And so the Quran is not a benign cultural artifact. It is something that actually takes, it comes and it intentionally takes Jesus off the throne. It says, say not three. It says Jesus, it makes a very strong point of emphasizing that Jesus is not God, that he's only human, that he did not die, that he was not raised again, and so forth. And so the attention that the Quran gives to that particular detail, making very sure that its readers understand that Jesus is not who the Bible says he is, should have been a clue to everybody in this issue. And so so the Quran is theologically incompatible with the Bible. And not only that, it is an attack on the Bible. And so the main thing that I want to emphasize in this at this time is that you have to please understand what the Quran is. And if those people had correctly understood, you know, it kind of drives me a little bit crazy every time people say, even though I study it, now I see Quran manuscripts that are beautifully written. I see, you know, inscriptions. Anybody here traveled to the Alhambra in Spain and Granada? It's beautiful, all this, the art and culture and everything that is surrounded. It's okay to look at that and appreciate the geometric beauty of things and so forth. I understand that. But when people look at the Quran and they say, oh, it's what a beautiful, lofty, elevated language and so forth, it does bother me a little bit, or by a little bit, I mean a lot. Because something that leads people away from salvation and puts them back on the road to hell is not a beautiful thing. I don't care how, you know, the angel of light is, you know, is beautiful, but it's not a beautiful thing. And so when you think about what is the Quran, whatever else you may, you know, for purpose of conversation, please understand that it is a theological statement. It's a very strong theological argument about who God is, what people must do to be saved, and it puts people back into a works-based salvation. And it is an affront to the Bible. And so if you understand that, then you'll have the right approach to all these other things, and you should be on mission boards making translations and not those other people who did that. So I will end it there, and thank you very much.